Hey everyone, welcome. Today, we're diving into the often misunderstood world of childhood psychological disorders. We're going to unpack some of the most common conditions, take a look at the signs, and really get to the heart of why this conversation matters so much. Let's get into it. We all have this picture in our heads of childhood, right? A totally carefree, happy time. And look, for a lot of kids, it really is. But for some, childhood can be a time of intense fear, of confusion. Kids are constantly trying to figure out new people, new situations, and all kinds of pressures. The reality is, it's often way more complicated than the storybook version. And this number, wow, it really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? We're not just talking about the typical childhood worries or the occasional temper tantrum. What surveys are telling us is that at least 1/5, that's 1 in 5, of all kids and teenagers in North America are dealing with a diagnosable psychological disorder. That is a staggering number. And it's a huge reminder that these challenges aren't rare at all. And, it's not just what's going on inside. The world outside can be pretty tough, too. Bullying, for instance, is a massive issue. I mean, this chart shows that more than a quarter of students say they get bullied frequently. And that kind of external pressure, it can have a huge, lasting impact on a child's mental well-being. Okay, so to really get a handle on these disorders, let's group them into a few key categories. We're going to kick things off with what psychologists call internalizing disorders. This is basically where a child's emotional distress gets turned inward, and it often shows up as things like overwhelming anxiety or a really deep sadness. So, a perfect example of this is something called separation anxiety disorder. It's actually one of the most common childhood anxiety disorders out there. And we're not just talking about a little bit of clinginess when a parent leaves. No, this is extreme, panicked anxiety that can be totally debilitating, making it incredibly hard for a kid to go to school or sometimes even just be in another room. Now, this is really interesting. When we think about depression, especially in kids, it doesn't always look like the profound sadness we might see in adults. A lot of the time, it can actually show up physically with things like constant headaches or stomach pain. Or you might see it in their behavior, maybe a sudden disinterest in their favorite toys and games, or just being irritable all the time. And while major depression isn't super common in really young kids, the numbers just explode during the teenage years. Think about that for a second. As many as 20% of adolescents go through at least one depressive episode. That makes it a massive challenge during what's already one of the most critical times in a person's development. All right, let's switch gears and talk about a completely different way kids might express what they're going through: externalizing disorders. So instead of turning their struggles inward, these kids act out. They express their pain through disruptive and often defiant behavior. Okay, so this slide breaks down two of the big ones, and it's super important to see the difference. On one side, you have oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD. This is characterized by a pattern of being argumentative, angry, and vindictive. But then on the other side, you've got conduct disorder, which is much more severe. This involves actions that actually violate the basic rights of other people, things like aggression, cruelty to people or animals, and even serious crimes like theft. Believe it or not, each of these disorders can affect up to 10% of children, so they're pretty common. And here's something kind of curious. Before puberty hits, both ODD and conduct disorder are diagnosed way more often in boys. It's a really interesting question that researchers are still digging into. Okay, for our next category, we're going to look at something that's literally rooted in the wiring of the brain: neurodevelopmental disorders. These are conditions that start during childhood and are tied to differences in how the brain actually develops and functions. So, I'm sure you've all heard of ADHD, or attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder. But what is it exactly? Well, at its core, it boils down to a child having a really tough time paying attention or behaving in a way that's overactive and impulsive, or in a lot of cases, both. And these core symptoms, they can create this ripple effect that leads to some pretty big challenges in a kid's life. Like we see here, it often leads to poor performance in school and makes it really difficult for them to interact with other kids. It's estimated that ADHD affects somewhere between 4 and 9% of all school children. All right, next up is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Just imagine for a second that connecting with other people feels like trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Well, that's a small glimpse into what it can be like for many people with ASD. It's marked by things like severe communication challenges, extreme unresponsiveness to others, and a strong preference for rigid, repetitive behaviors. But, to really understand where we are with autism today, we have to look back at a really dark part of its history. For decades, there was this incredibly influential and deeply harmful theory that blamed parents. This quote here refers to the awful idea of refrigerator parents, this notion that cold, rejecting parents were somehow the cause of their child's autism. So let me be crystal clear here. That theory has been completely and totally debunked by science. It's not just a wrong idea. It caused generations of parents an immense amount of pain and guilt. All of the research today points overwhelmingly to biological causes, things like brain abnormalities and cognitive factors, as the real drivers behind autism spectrum disorder. So, we've covered a lot of ground, right? From those internal struggles of anxiety all the way to the outward expressions of defiance. But just knowing about these conditions, well, it isn't enough. The real goal is always to move from just being aware to taking meaningful action. Look, if you take away just one thing from all of this, let it be this. These disorders are real medical conditions. They are not flaws in a child's character. As we've seen, they're incredibly common. And the most important part, they are treatable. With the right diagnosis, the right support, and the right therapies, kids can absolutely learn to manage their symptoms and thrive. So I'm going to leave you with a question. How can our communities do a better job of supporting children's mental health? Because it's about so much more than just individual treatment. It's about the kind of communities we build for them. The answer to that question could truly change a life. Thanks so much for joining me.